from the heart of rural France. This is the Keto Woman podcast, brought to you by me. Hello Keto Lovelies, I'm Daisy Brackenhall, and I've spent most of my life struggling with my weight and confidence, and have always had a difficult relationship with food. Even when I finally got to my target weight, after weight loss surgery and eating low carb, I couldn't maintain it and I was miserable. I've been keto now for over 2 years, and it has given me the freedom to fall in love with food again, without the constant gain, loss, guilt, virtue cycle of before. Health and happiness is where it's at now, running on fat. Welcome to the Keto Woman podcast. Each week I'll be chatting to inspirational women, maybe even the odd man, to discover the secrets to their success so that I can share them with you. So what is keto? Keto is a way of eating that enables you to switch your body's main fuel source from sugar to fat. Who doesn't want to be a fat burner, right? But how do we achieve this? A great place to start is by keeping carbs under 20 grams a day. So things like leafy greens and above ground vegetables, plus some nuts and seeds and the incidental carbs you find in things like full fat dairy. Choose delicious fatty proteins and be free and easy with oily dressings on salad and butter on your veggies. Once you're in the swing of things, you can tweak it to suit you. Make your own personalized keto. You'll hear all sorts of ways to keto from my guests. There is no one way to do keto, no one size fits all. I hope to show you just how flexible and fabulous this way of eating can be. I'm not a doctor, and most of my guests won't be either, so we really can't give you medical advice. It's always best to consult your own doctor when making big changes to your diet and lifestyle, because they know you and your medical history, and so have access to the bigger picture. Wouldn't it be helpful to have one place where you could find all the links? Want to sign up to my new Patreon exclusive Facebook group, Daisy's Lovelies? No problem. How about subscribing to my YouTube channel? Please help me notch up my first 1,000 subscribers by going to links.ketowomanpodcast.com and following the YouTube link. Not following me on Instagram yet? Hit the Instagram button. You get the idea. All the buttons, all the links you need are at links.ketowomanpodcast.com. Thank you, Samantha Clark, for supporting me and this podcast by making a pledge at my Patreon page. Do you want to hear your name here at the top of the show? Are you enjoying this podcast and would like to help me make more episodes? Then head over to my Patreon page at patreon.com/KetoWoman or hit the support button on the Keto Woman podcast website. It means a great deal to me, and you will get to headline the show just like Samantha did today. Welcome to episode number 152, where I'm joined by extraordinary woman Jen Unwin. Dr. Jennifer Unwin is a consultant and clinical health psychologist with over 30 years of NHS experience. She specialises in helping people with chronic illnesses to improve their lives through solution-focused brief therapy, a psychological approach based on solution building rather than problem solving. She is former chair of the UK Association for Solution-Focused Practice. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Unwin contributed to 19 clinical papers and 2 published books. She is also a renowned public speaker, having spoken at conferences and events worldwide. She recently retired from her NHS role in May 2019 and now dedicates her time to working alongside Dr. David Unwin to provide innovative and results-driven patient care to those with type 2 diabetes and sugar addiction through Diabetes Digital Media. DDM is an award-winning digital health platform offering scalable and evidence-based health solutions to those with diabetes. Together, the Unwins have pioneered the use of low-carbohydrate diets in the treatment of obesity and diabetes through a patient-centric model of hope. Dr. Unwin believes that every piece of bad news, for example a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, can be turned on its head to become a golden opportunity for change. Since the success of the low-carb initiative is largely reliant on hope, the most important part is to address the patient's personal goals. Dr. Unwin draws on her extensive psychological knowledge to promote a two-way discussion which is informative, motivating and fulfilling for both doctor and patient. Through hard work, perseverance, and most of all, taking the time to understand each patient's individual needs and goals, David and Jen Unwin have proved that low-carb lifestyles work, that they last, and that they can be made accessible to all. I've been bumping into Jen at conferences for the last few years and have enjoyed very much watching her present as well as getting the opportunity to chat. Her and David are universally liked within the low-carb and keto community, and justifiably so. It is no surprise then that the warmth and compassion they both have permeates through their work. I joke in the podcast that everyone will want a GP like David, but it is true. They have set the bar very high for what the standard of care needs to look like. I hope you enjoy spending the next hour or so with Jen as much as I did. Welcome, Jen, to the Keto Woman podcast. It's fantastic to have you here today. Finally, we're getting together. How are you doing today?
That's great. Yes, I'm really, really pleased to be on. Yeah, great. Actually, we're doing really well. Thank you.
We've met up a few times and I keep saying I must get you on the podcast and I keep forgetting to follow
Mostly
up.
in airport lounges
Yes,
over the world.
Right.
We must do that.
That's right. We were on the same plane, weren't we, on the way to Denver?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you could start with just telling the listeners a bit about you.
Right. Yes, with pleasure. So I'm a clinical psychologist by background. I've actually retired last year from the NHS. I've done 32 years in the NHS.
Wow.
My interest was helping people with chronic long-term conditions have the best quality of life that they could with that condition. So it was a lot about supporting people's kind of emotional health, but also, were there things that they could do differently, et cetera, and working in groups and that kind of thing. So I'd done that sort of all my professional career and was very interested in hope, the idea of hope and how you instill hope in people who've sometimes, due to illness or emotional difficulties or whatever reason, have lost hope for some sort of a better future. So that's the sort of things that I help people with clinically, but also did some research and so on. And then probably quite a few of the listeners know that I'm married to Dr. David Unwin, low carb GP. And what happened there was it must be 8 or 9 years ago now, two things kind of came together in space and time like they do sometimes in life. The first thing was that it was the new year. And so obviously I was starting my new diet. I can't remember what number diet it would have been. Let's say n to the power of 12 or something. So I'm in Morrison's in the UK there. And there's in the discounted books, there was one called Escape the Diet Trap by Dr. John Briffer. I don't know if you've read that, Daisy.
I haven't, no. I'll have a look.
And it was £1 or something. So I thought, oh God, that's me. I need to escape the diet trap, desperate after Christmas to kind of lose some weight, but not wanting to go on another pointless diet. So I pick up this book, go home and read it, and kept reading bits of it out to David. And John Briffer's actually a GP in the UK who at that time was talking about and obviously writing about low carbohydrate diets, amazingly, because I just hadn't, although I felt I'd done every diet under the universe, I hadn't sort of heard too much about that. Apart from Atkins, obviously we'd all come across Atkins, haven't we? So I'm reading this book and really understanding the physiology and the reasons why it would make sense to cut sugar and carbohydrates out of your diet. So as I say, I'm reading that out, and I had a go. I went cold turkey and felt like I was dying for about 8 days. I remember just kind of sitting in a chair, kind of thinking, oh, God. But, he'd told me that things would get better in this book, you see, so I powered through. And yes, lo and behold, day 8, the lights went on and I felt amazing. So that was sort of happening in the background. On the other side, David had got to the age of about, I think it was about 8 years ago, he'd be about 56 at the time, and working in GP land, and it got quite disheartened really because people were getting sicker. The more, all he had was kind of drugs up his sleeve. People were getting more and more unwell. Lots of people will have heard him talk about this in his talks.
Yes, I was just going to say that. Yeah, just that whole negative atmosphere all the time.
More and more drugs. And, there was 8-fold the number of type 2 diabetics in the same practice from when he started.
You can't really tick the job fulfillment box, can you?
No. And in fact, he hated it so much, he'd given all the diabetes work to one of the other partners. And I mean, we didn't really know it at the time, but looking back, he was probably pre-diabetic. So he was really sleepy in the afternoons, was having a little snooze on his couch and so on. We had a conversation, me trying to sort of get him to sort of look at this idea of to sort of be more hopeful really about his practice or even his retirement. Like if he was going to retire, how would he like to look back on that? Or how, what would he like to achieve before he retired? And we had one of those sorts of conversations. And as I say, it came at the same time as me reading and doing this low carb stuff from reading John Briffa's book. And also he had a patient come to see him. He also talks about this if you watch any of his videos. He called one lady in because she wasn't taking her diabetic medication. He could tell because she wasn't cashing in the prescriptions. And when she walked in the room, he sent her out because he thought she was someone else. He didn't realize that she was the same lady. She'd lost so much weight and she'd completely put her diabetes into remission. So he was talking to her about it and she'd done it by low carb. So these things all came together. And then we decided to do a project together. We'd never worked together, even though we're in the same town sort of professionally. And GPs never run groups, so he'd never run a group. And I think groups are fantastically powerful, that the aspect of social support, but also the hopefulness of seeing other people who've done well and encouraging each other and so on. So we had the crazy idea of setting up a low carb group for the type 2 or pre-diabetic and type 2 diabetes patients in the practice. So we just wrote to everybody and said, come along, and off we went. And at the time, of course, we didn't realize how controversial and controversial that was going to be. So the dietitian walked out of the practice and wouldn't come, never came back. And I suppose we did know that it was something that wasn't being done elsewhere in the health service. So that's why David started collecting all the data on people's cholesterol profiles, weight, renal function, blood pressure, etc., etc. So we had a full data set on these people, and that's still ongoing now. So there's now hundreds of people enrolled in that cohort, and I think he's up to 84, 85 cases of diabetes type 2 in remission.
Fantastic.
And about a quarter of the diabetes patients in the practice, and that they're now saving £50,000 a year compared to the average in the area on diabetes drugs alone. And obviously people come off other drugs as well, high blood pressure drugs, antidepressants and so on. So we're still running the groups. Now we're doing it on Zoom. That's
what always gets me. You hear about all these things we need to do to save the NHS. Well, here's an idea for an allegedly progressive disease.
And what's interesting is that even locally, it hasn't really been adopted. Yeah, it's crazy. You'd think people would absolutely bite his hand off. I mean, it is now, after about 8 years, some of the other practices locally, and obviously other doctors around the UK that have heard him speak, are starting to do this and are getting the same results. So it really does roll out. Especially
when you've got the data, like you say. I mean, that surely is speaking their language, isn't it? There's no sort of airy-fairy anecdotal. This is hard data we're talking about here.
Hard data. And I think that we're so glad that we did that right from the beginning, because if anybody's seen the data or read the papers, they'll see, that's, I mean, the results compared to any medication, and people come off all their medications, so, but compared to any medication, outcomes are amazing. And just the lives changed and the story. And we've got one amazing lady who's now lost about 9 stone, who was in a wheelchair. So talk about quality of life differences.
Absolutely.
She's really transformed. Yeah, so we've kind of been doing that in the background. And then, as I say, I retired from the NHS last May. And my personal story is, as you've heard, one of being a serial dieter. And I've come to sort of recognise and be very interested in the whole concept and idea, and what's the research behind the idea of food being addictive, sugar and carbohydrates in particular being addictive, both from a personal point of view, but also clinically, and wondering how we can sort of bring that now into the low carb keto world to help people who struggle even to keep long term on that kind of lifestyle. So for the last year, that's what I've been sort of interested in, and I've been studying with Bitten Johnson, that some people will be aware of in Sweden, who's been doing this work most of her professional career, beavering away there in Sweden, trying to help people with sugar addiction. I think more and more people are kind of getting interested in it, really. And so that's my latest interest.
It's another area, isn't it? It seems that it's a struggle to get this recognition. I'm thinking back to the presentation you gave at the PHC conference in 2018 about sugar addiction. You and Charlotte Summers had us standing up through a list of questions, which turned out to be the way you would diagnose substance use. Mm-hmm. I think I'm right in saying that.
Alcohol.
Yes. But what you were saying was that the DSM-5 doesn't recognize food addiction as being an addiction yet. Exactly. We certainly all in the audience disagreed with that.
Did. Yes. So if you ask the general public, is sugar addictive? 80% of people are going to go, well, yes, because either they themselves or they know people who have real problems moderating their sugar or stopping, even if they know it's doing them harm, and craving sugar. And all of those are obviously symptoms of an addiction. So you'd recognize that, wouldn't you? If you're a smoker and you're trying to give up, well, you crave it. You try and give it up and you get withdrawal symptoms. You struggle to stay off it, even though you know it's doing you harm. Same with alcohol for some people. So it feels like a bit of a no-brainer, but in the scientific community, yes. I mean, there's even debate. We had a little debate on Twitter the other day. Is it food addiction or is it sugar addiction? What should we call it? Or some people say processed food addiction. So there's a whole debate there to be had. It's not recognised so the DSM-5 we're on now, aren't we, which is Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, doesn't recognise it. That's the manual that tends to be used in America and over here in Europe. And then people may have also heard of the ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization. They also have a manual of sort of recognised conditions, and it's not in there either. Although a process addiction like gambling is recognised. Because people often say, well, food isn't a psychoactive substance, which we could go into the research that, some research that sort of actually shows that it is, but gambling doesn't have any substance at all. And that's recognised as a process addiction.
Right. Yeah.
So if nothing else, I would argue that it should be recognised that these problems, eating too much sugar and carbohydrate, should be recognised as, if nothing else, a process addiction, even if people don't accept that there's a sort of physiological basis to it, which I actually think there is. I think there's several mechanisms that we could discuss that were sort of, there is evidence for the physiological mechanism. Yeah,
I mean, how would you use it? I mean, I certainly used to use carbohydrates as a means to numb myself, and also knowing that it would make me sleepy, because sleep was the other thing that I used.
Yes, exactly.
So, well, that's a physiological change. So.
Exactly. All to do with insulin. So we eat a lot, the insulin goes up, and that makes us more sleepy, and it allows tryptophan to cross the blood-brain barrier, which means we can make serotonin, it's made from tryptophan. So you can make serotonin more easily if there's a lot of insulin. Also, you obviously get the dopamine hit, which is a sort of reward center hit, which is incredibly powerful on a sort of neurophysiological level. We all crave that sort of dopamine type hit.
Yes, I was very interested in what you were saying about tryptophan and serotonin and that repeated use.
Yes.
And then the link to depression. People know that link with serotonin and with depression, with the medical treatments that are used. So I was very interested to hear about that cascade effect from prolonged use of sugar and the effects it has.
Yeah. So the brain, like any biological system, it's trying to stay in homeostasis. So say with the dopamine, so you get the dopamine hit from the sugar, But the brain doesn't like this kind of flooding with dopamine. So it downgrades your dopamine receptors. That's why next time you have to have more. Like exactly the same with alcohol, that, you don't get the same hit from the same amount of sugar or alcohol. So you have to have more to get the same hit. But then you're in a horrible trap because your brain's actually down-regulating your dopamine receptors, so that other ways of getting dopamine, which would be healthier, are sort of neglected. You're just chasing this one hit, this one way of getting it, if you like. And you often see that in people with addiction problems, that they become very focused on the one thing.
Well, that's the other problem with our brain, isn't it? Its default position is always to take the easiest route for something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really energy hungry, and it's much easier for it to just take the well-worn path.
Yeah.
Even if it happens to be damaging.
Absolutely. And it's so automatic. So the other thing that I always say to people is that because the part of the brain that's involved is very reptilian, it's very primitive, the reward parts of the brain. And like you say, obviously we're driven to survival. So in the autumn, if there was any sugar, any fruit, any, honey or whatever there was, then right, we're off. We're here because our ancestors were good at that. We've survived because our ancestors were the ones that could cram down all the fruit and so on in the autumn. And now it's around all the time, isn't it? That primitive drive, you kind of you can't think your way out of it. It's sort of automatic. And I often used to have that. I think I said it in the talk actually, and a lot of people recognised it. You might get up one morning and decide, you're going to have your healthy eating day, and then, as if an alien has taken over your body, you watch your own hand reaching for something, the kid's chocolate egg or whatever it is, and you're kind of thinking, you're almost saying to yourself as you're doing it that you don't want to do it. And that's because it's this, as I say, the difference between the frontal thinking part of the brain, which we think, we're all so intellectual, don't we? But actually that won't trump the reptile part of the brain. Will always win, and we're always going to want that hit, that dopamine hit.
Yes, I was watching a video yesterday where they were talking about, and I can't remember which psychology approach it was. I've watched so many over the last week or so, but they were talking about trying to get into wise brain mode, and that you can find yourself in this battle between emotion and logic.
Yeah.
And yes, they can have those arguments. And I can remember those very clearly. My body is wanting to drive me to the ice cream that's in the freezer, and my logical brain is no. As I'm walking towards it.
as the reptile brain is winning. Or monkey mind. There's been some really good books, haven't there, on managing your monkey mind. So I think the takeaway from that for people is that you can't think your way out of it. What you have to do is act your way out of it. So that it's not that we're helpless and hopeless. It's that we have to prioritize cleaning up our environment. So, I mean, you're probably the same as me now. We never have anything in the house that would be remotely anything that I probably would be all right having things in the house because I'm so out of the habit. But certainly in the early days, and for some people forever, it's really good just to clean up your environment, because we're so cued by that. That's what cues the hand. you see it, and there's this automatic kind of cue to go and get it. So definitely cleaning up the environment, and just doing different stuff, learning new habits, building up new habits, and if you fall off the wagon, go again. Just keep trying to sort of change the way that you respond to these kind of cues, or build up other sort of routines that are around the time when you might have been struggling. It can be anything, phone a friend, jog around the garden once, put on your favourite music and dance around the kitchen. Anything sort of physical that kind of acts you out of that loop. But it is very difficult, and it does require kind of almost like a lifetime's work. If you're a proper hardened sugar addict, you have to keep working at it. It's like a recovery journey, definitely. Yes,
and being aware of how much our environment is sort of set against us, really. There are just traps absolutely everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's obesogenic everywhere these days. I mean, as we can remember, can't we, I certainly can, when there weren't the sweets all over the tills, and you didn't go in the garage. There wasn't chocolate and cake in the garage. There wasn't, office cake wasn't a thing particularly.
Snacks weren't. I mean, I can remember actually when that started quite early for me, probably in the first year or two of primary school. But it was definitely at that time when it was a new thing, when it was starting to be sold to us through adverts from manufacturers and things. I think of the finger of fudge advert and all these sorts of, Milky Way being something that you could eat between meals and it wouldn't fill you
sold
up.
To children, wasn't it?
I can remember the growth of that, but it being something new.
Yeah.
And now it's absolutely the norm.
Yeah. Completely the norm. And, I feel really sad on a deep level for children who are, being brought up in that way from such an early age, and how hard it'll be for them to stay healthy and kind of keep out of that trap, because a proportion of them will really struggle. Yes.
And another thing you mentioned, which of course is what these manufacturers are taking advantage of, is the hyperpalatability of food. And I think that's something that often people breathe a real sigh of relief when someone can tell them, look, it's not your fault.
Absolutely.
Actually things are set up against you. Yeah.
They were designed in the lab. I mean, I've been learning a little bit recently from Joan Ifland, who's another, she's a woman in the States who's done her PhD and written the most amazing tome of all the research on processed food addiction. But how when the tobacco companies saw the writing on the wall, in terms of actually it was being recognised that it was tobacco that was generally harming people, that they invested in the big food companies and then brought to play their whole playbook on kind of sales and manufacturing, packaging, making things look appealing. And also, a lot of the foods that we do find irresistible were they were genuinely designed in labs to be irresistible. Like, they're even marketed as such, like, is it Pringles, isn't it? Or Doritos.
Yeah, once you pop, you can't stop.
You can't stop, yeah. And that is, that's certainly true. And it's that sort of bliss point, isn't it, with the salt and the slight sweetness and the and the
fat.
And
I call it the unholy trinity: fat, sugar, and salt.
Absolutely.
You get that balance just right. Or the other thing I used to do was swing between the two.
Yeah.
So I would overeat savoury, then I would go to sweet until I was just completely overdone that. But to balance that out,
yes,
I would swing back to savoury and I would just seesaw between the two.
Because you get sort of satiated with one, but there's still sort of, absolutely, yes. And of course that's the whole thing again about just going back. The evolutionary stuff I think is really interesting. And of course that doesn't occur in nature. It doesn't occur in nature anyway. So that naturally, things were seasonal. So if there was fruit, we had it, but that was the end of it. You couldn't keep it particularly, and the other things they were sort of satiating. There's natural processes again in the body, aren't there, with fat and protein, that the body can regulate the amount it needs and does that effortlessly, like all other animals in the wild. Why would we be any different? Monkeys aren't dieting in the wild. They just eat what they need and kind of get on with their lives. And we've lost that ability because all of that has been, as we said, hijacked. So the kinds of foods we eat hijack our appetite and override those satiety mechanisms. And at the same time, we're all supposed to be a size 8. So there's like a perfect storm, all this wonderful stuff to eat, and yet we're not supposed to eat it and supposed to have some control. So I think then people end up, as I say, in these horrible kind of traps that do make them feel really hopeless. And they do, like you say, they blame themselves. They don't realise that actually. I think it's great when you realise all this stuff because it makes you sort of more angry, if anything. Oh, I've been had by the food
yes,
companies.
you tune in and you've taken, I forget which colour pill it is in the matrix that you take to become aware, whether it's red or blue, but you get my meaning. You've taken the one that wakes you up and suddenly makes you aware of what's going on.
And once you've seen it, the scales have followed. You can't unsee it. As I say, even if then the journey is quite a long one. Like, so we're still changing things after 8 years in terms of, exactly, we all change, don't we, over the years, but what we eat and at what times and so on. We're still sort of refining that and what works and how to eat when you go out. And all of that is, I think, is a lifelong journey. And I think that's fine. I think that's fine so long as you're heading in the right direction and, you're feeling well and enjoying life. That's the main thing.
That's a great example that you used about talking about animals in the wild, because of course that's a great demonstration of what goes wrong quite often when you take them out of that and you put them in things like zoos and things. They often develop.
They then go wrong. Yes.
Problems.
Yes.
Both physical and mental from being taken out of their natural habitat and being fed differently. Yeah. And they develop similar problems.
David often says, if you had a human pet or in a zoo, how would you keep it so it kept kind of well and glossy and sort of, happy and wasn't sort of picking at itself? Or what would you feed it? And
rocking in the corner.
It's not rocking in the corner. Yeah, exactly. So, I think nutrition is one big part of it, isn't it? And I think that's the part we've obviously been most interested in. But there are loads of other things, aren't there, that modern life has messed with, like the sunlight and being told to sort of stay out of the sun. And obviously this kind of epidemic now of people with low vitamin D and how that's kind of interacted
really
with COVID risk. Really interesting. Yeah. So movement, sunlight, nutrition, connection, social connections.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That is interesting, the evolutionary aspect, really? Because it's the further and further you move away from that. Interesting point though, and I always like to think of the thing that possibly confounds the argument. And when you mentioned about seasonality, and obviously, very true and works for a lot of us, especially with things like fruit. What about those areas of the world where they are still seasonal to a certain extent, but they're available all year round? Evolutionary, do we develop differently to be able to cope with that, maybe?
Yeah, probably there's some genetic variation around the world, isn't there, for being able to sort of tolerate different diets if you've sort of evolved by the sea and or you've got fruit or whatever. Yes. Yeah, definitely. No, it's a very good point. And of course, people always say, don't they, well, the cultures that kind of eat a lot of rice and still don't have a lot of diabetes, for example, but it looks as if they don't eat as often as we might. And also they do a hell of a lot of physical exercise. So they tend to retain their insulin sensitivity better than we do.
Yes, when you look at it closely, there are other factors so you're really not comparing like to like without taking all these other things.
I'm interested in this stuff that's coming up now as well about seed oils being a major factor in messing with people's insulin resistance, which I always thought it was about sugar, but I've a couple of people in the space that I quite respect are now thinking about seed oils being another major driver of metabolic ill health. I don't know if you've seen that. So I think that's important as well.
Yes, I've thought of it as being important, but kind of secondary. Yeah. The kind of, well, yes, it's preferable if you avoid them, but it's not as much the end of the world as sugar. Yeah. But yes, like you say, it seems to be coming.
It's growing as a real interference in that process and maybe setting people up early. So I noticed Ketogenic Girl has put something up about it just this week.
Right.
And also, who's the other person? The guy who wrote the Carnivore Code, Paul Saladino.
Oh, yes. Okay. I have to check that out.
He's been saying stuff about that as well. So, so that's interesting. Yeah, and of course, they're just processed food, aren't they? So they're ultra-processed oils.
Well, and of course, saturated fat, predominantly animal fats, have been demonized for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's changing.
That's changing, fortunately, because I do think, certainly from a mental health point of view, there does seem to be quite a lot of evidence. If you look at, and Georgia Eads stuff, obviously, that our brains are largely cholesterol. So it does make sense that we need to eat some saturated fat to help our brains and help all the transmitters that we're trying to make. We need to manufacture those from something, and you can't manufacture that in the body. So
it's so frustrating, though. It seems to be, a few steps forward and then only for a step back. I'm thinking of David's spoons of sugar infographics that were actually taken on board by the NHS and distributed and made a real focus of.
Yes.
And then, I mean, you tell us the story, but it seems that just because of some article in the Daily Mail or something of all
Sunday.
places,
Yes.
they're under threat, which seems absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. So what he did, so people found it quite hard to understand the sort of carbs and sugar in foods that weren't sugary. And of course, that's key, isn't it, to helping people with type 2 diabetes understand that cornflakes digest down into sugar, so much sugar, rice, again, sort of. So he was kind of trying to work out a way to explain this in a simple way to people. So, I mean, I don't still understand it quite now, but it's to do with the glycemic index and glycemic load. You can do calculations and then turn that food into an equivalent sort of teaspoon of table sugar, which is fructose plus glucose. So you can say, for example, the famous example, of course, is the banana, isn't it? And that was the one that was featured in the article, that, your average banana digests down into about 6 teaspoons of sugar. And that was taken up by NICE, who are the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, as supporting information for their diabetes guidelines, which state that people with type 2 diabetes should be advised low glycemic index sources of carbohydrate. And it was to sort of help people understand what those were. So that's all good. And the calculations are completely correct. Of course, if different people eat a banana, different people digest that differently. And whether you're type 2 or pre-diabetic or not diabetic at all, how insulin sensitive you are, will affect how much your blood sugar's actually affected.
Absolutely.
So the article was basically saying that the infographics were wrong, because if the two people that they tested, one was a pre-diabetic and one was not diabetic, if they ate a banana or if they ate table sugar, 6 teaspoons of table sugar,
they should have exactly the same,
which they weren't. But I must say, if those were my readings that they had in the article, they had big rises of blood sugar.
I remember thinking that, and especially about the rice as well. The rice was, I was thinking, I wouldn't want to see that graph.
Want to see that
Thank
graph.
you.
And they were, the young people, they're not middle-aged even.
My feeling was that they were trying to take an easy to understand visual representation and trying to take that as if it was saying this is 100%
what will happen
scientifically accurate.
Yes.
That
what will happen
if you
in
go
your
and do a
bloodstream.
scientific test with this is absolutely exactly what's going to happen, which obviously it's not.
Yeah.
It's to give you an idea, to give you a very easy, quick way to understand what kind of impact these foods might have.
What can you say? I mean, I think, as we all know in this field, there's always been a lot of pushback, and there's understandable pushback from the food industry at whatever level, and probably from pharma as well. I don't know. I don't want to be too much of a conspiracy theorist. It's interesting that this week it's been announced that the NHS is going to be backing the 800-calorie shake diet. I don't know if you've picked that up this week in the UK.
I really haven't seen that.
Yeah. So just this week it's come out that the NHS is backing it's basically Cambridge diet shakes, isn't it? I don't know if you've been following the direct trial. So I don't know.
Back to the good
you
old.
decide, listener.
Low fat, low
you
calorie.
decide what's going on.
And what's the outcome? Do you know? Are they going to be removed? Has the petition, whenever I look at it,
doing
is
pretty
climbing.
Sam from the PHC. Yeah, so if anyone wants to sign, have a look at the PHC.
Yeah, we'll put a link. Will that be enough to save them? I hope so.
I don't know, but I think it's really reasonable that, and David's going to write to NICE as well, because the point was that if nothing else, the process needs to be reviewed, because what happened was, you can see, if people go to the petition, they can see if we did a freedom of information request, or I didn't, but people did, what was the process by which they were removed. And really, it was just basically a letter from the journalist at the Mail on Sunday saying, kind of, remove it or else, or else we'll publish this about you. And with unnamed sources who'd said this about it, so this dietitian says this about them, or an unnamed person says this about the resource. There wasn't anybody named in it, and also David wasn't given any right to respond. He should have been given a right to say, well, that isn't accurate, that's not the case. Yeah, it'll rumble on, I think. I don't know whether there'll ever be reinstated, but they're still right. Nobody's disputed that the calculations are wrong. The calculations are correct. They're still an educational tool for people to understand the amount of sugar that is in carbohydrate foods. So they're still on the PHC website. They can still be distributed.
It's just such a shaky foundation to remove something. Yes, absolutely. And
yeah, but it went through their processes, and they were rigorous processes for it to be approved in the first place.
Exactly.
Yes, so they're still kind of saying that they're somehow their
that's
processes
what I mean. It
were
seems,
wrong. Yeah.
Yes, it seems a very shaky foundation to remove them so quickly and easily.
Yes.
And I think part of the problem is that these people seem to be thinking that we're saying you have to present this kind of information, you have to present a low-carb diet as the only way to solve this problem. Because nobody's saying that.
No.
Saying we want to be able to offer this as an alternative to our patients. And actually, it's criminal not to tell them about it.
I think you've nailed it there.
We're not necessarily expecting them to have to do it.
Yeah.
But look, hey, this is an option.
It should be
if
a choice.
You want to.
Yeah. And I think, when people are offered the shake trial, they should be told that the results are actually just as good from low carb. And, you don't have to do the shake bit first necessarily. All the patients at Norwood went straight on to a low carb plan. Yes, I agree with you. I think it is about personal choice, but then that the option should be there. And we've never really quite understood what the hostility is or what the difficulty is, why people get so aerated and defensive about it when it does and can work so well, particularly if people want to do it. And a lot of people are wanting to do it and they're not getting the support, even when they're asking, they're saying, I want to do this. They're being told that it's dangerous or unsustainable or, and really that's not the evidence. As I say, we've got people in the group who've been doing it as long as we have, 8 years, and still medication free. They haven't relapsed or gone back into an unwell state. So in our experience, it's not for everybody, but 800 calorie diet shakes on, they wouldn't be for me. So
well, and I think even if they were something that you might want to use for the short term, you can't possibly see them as being sustainable for the rest of your life. So what are you going to do at the end of, however long you're going to do it for? Well, what happens after that?
Yeah.
That's the problem. Yes. Unless you're saying to someone, you've got to live off these shakes for the rest of your life, which nobody's going to want to do.
We already know that people rebound, don't we? That's kind of accepted now, isn't it? That crash diets lead to kind of rebound weight gain. So exactly, that people are going to need a lot of support to do something sustainable. And as you say, what's that? What advice have they been giving at that point?
I really like the presentation that you did at Denver, the role play. I thought that was fantastic, and I really liked the approach. That anyone must have been envious, because it's not something that they'd get from their local GP. I should imagine everyone would want to sign up with David. But perhaps you could just talk a little bit about the approach that you discussed in the presentation, because I really liked it. It was a very kind way to help people who are often in a place where they're feeling at the least, frustrated, but probably feeling very helpless, and maybe stuck. Even at the point where they're feeling hopeless.
Yeah, no, definitely. So what I wanted to sort of come up with, and what we've come up with sort of over the years, between us from the psychology, but also trying to put it into practice in David's practice, is because really at the end of the day, with these chronic conditions, particularly diabetes and those other sorts of conditions, it's about behavior change, isn't it? And like we've said, that's a kind of lifelong thing. It's a challenge because of the environment we live in. So people have to be super motivated to get going, and then hopefully notice the benefits and then keep going. So how can we help doctors or other just ourselves or anyone who's having a conversation with someone else.
Yes, that's a good point, actually. You could be someone who said, well, tell me about this keto thing. How do I get started? And you know that they might find it difficult to get going. So you can be using this on a very personal basis as well.
Personal basis, or, anything, not even to do with nutrition, like anything you're trying to kind of change or do differently in life.
That's right.
We have to kind of think about it in a different way. So it was how to help David to do that in these 10-minute appointments, because doctors and nurses often say, and in a way quite rightly, we just haven't got the time. So it has to be something that integrates with what they're already doing and actually sort of enhances it in a way so they get better outcomes. And as you saw, David, since he's been doing it, he gets people coming and, telling him how well they're doing, and that makes his work a lot more cheerful and uplifting as well. Right. So, he's not feeling like burnt out and leaving the profession.
Completely changes the energy.
So it comes from two sort of sources. One is sort of positive psychology research about what helps people to do well, what helps people to change behavior and to flourish. And also the approach that I don't know if you'll have come across yet in the training that you're doing, but the one that always sat best with me and I always found most effective is a solution-focused approach. And so it comes with sort of melding of these two ideas. And the model, so I can send you the link to the paper where we've written it up in more detail if people want to read more about it. But we called it GRIN so people could remember. And there's only 4 steps. It's goals, resources, increments, and noticing. And goals is that you always start with what's important to that person. It doesn't have to be, people often talk about a concrete goal when you say, what are your best hopes? Or, for our work together, what do you want? In 6 months' time, how would you know it had been a success? People often say, well, I'll have lost 2 stone, or they'll give you a concrete kind of answer, which is great. That's nice. But to get that sort of motivational connection, it's important to ask, well, what difference would that make? What would be better in your life? So that they then start talking about things that are meaningful to them. So we often get answers like, I could kick around the football with the grandkids, I can enjoy going on walking holidays with my husband, whatever it is, what's actually going to be different in their lives, because otherwise there's no motivation to change. Losing 2 stone is a kind of,
That's right. It's very abstract, isn't it? Abstract. You need those real solid roots that gives you something to work towards.
Yeah. Or it might be that, they want to experience less pain, for example. And, again, what difference would that make? What would you be doing differently? How would your life be richer? So that's the G, the sort of goals part, a nice exploration of that. And the more detail you can get, the more someone can imagine that happening. We know that gives that sort of pull, that sort of motivational pull. And then resources is that always people have more going for them, usually than they think, and usually than So what are they good at personally? What are their personal strengths? Are they an organised person? Are they a determined person? What have they got through in the past? Who's around helping them or kind of on their team? Usually, hopefully, not everybody, but, people have either someone that they're living with or a friend or relative who would, really be on the project with them. Are they already doing things that are working? So usually people don't start from zero. They even if they're wanting to lose a certain amount of weight, they've perhaps already lost some in the past.
Yes, I was going to say, what happens if someone comes to you where they feel that they really are rock bottom?
Absolutely rock bottom. Is
that where you have to tap back into something historic?
Could be something historic, or quite a good question is how are you even keeping going? How are you, what's keeping you going?
Good question.
And then they might say, well, the dog, or, my sister's always been, so they'll come up with something.
So you can always find something.
Or they'll say, I just keep going. That's the person I am. So you can always find something, yeah.
I love what you said about motivation. I think before in the presentation, before you got into the model, and that your assumption is that everybody has innate motivation and it's your job to uncover it and fuel it.
Absolutely.
I really like that.
Yeah.
That it's there.
Everybody's, even if it's kind of buried because they've got really hopeless, they could tell you what a better future would be. And sometimes you have to say, like, forget how you're going to get there. But, if I was to wave a magic wand, literally, what would be better? What would, yes. So you can fan those flames in various ways. And there's more descriptions of the kind of questions in the paper. So GR, goals, resources, and then increments is the idea that wherever you are, like you say, even if you're starting from 0, once you've got an idea of where you're trying to get to, that's the sort of 10 out of 10 is this kind of lose 2 stone, so you can kick around with the kids and you know, you're feeling more energetic and sleeping better, or whatever the description is. You know, even if the person's at 0, it's good to ask, what would 1 look like? Not what are you going to do next, because they would have done that if they could think of it, but what would 1 look like? And they usually come up with something, you know, quite kind of proximal, quite doable. So it might be, you know, not having sugar in the tea, or, you know, I don't know, going a walk, but whatever they come up with. And again, they've come
something
up with
that feels manageable.
It's manageable. But because they've come up with it, they wouldn't say it if they couldn't imagine themselves doing it. Having said it, they imagine themselves doing it. You can ask again, well, you know, if you were able to do that walk around the block once a day, what difference might that make? Or, you know, so you can start to sort of almost explore the reality of they've already done it. Yeah, so next small steps. And that's something you can keep pursuing once you're kind of off and running. You can keep saying, well, you're here now, you know, what's the next little bit look like?
You can climb up.
And then noticing is the last one. So GRIN is for noticing. And that's the human nature is to notice problems, difficulties, issues, things we wish we'd done better, regrets. And doctors are also trained to notice what's wrong with people. So the noticing piece is around encouraging ourselves, but also for the doctor as well, to start trying to notice what's going better and what's working, and to actually ask that, you know, so what's better since we last met? And people always kind of go, oh, doctors don't normally ask me what's better. But usually they can think of something, you know, the breathing's a little bit easier, or, you know, they managed to have their tea without sugar in it, or whatever it is, what's better. And you can keep asking what else is better, but also encouraging the person to keep a note of successes, you know, what's working. If it's not working, do something a bit different. And that's that issue about that kind of lifelong journey, really about refining what's working when we feel at our best, and really noticing, you know, oh God, I didn't actually feel great after I ate that piece of birthday cake. I actually felt really rubbish, and I'll try and remember that next time. So GRIN, goals, resources, increments, noticing, and you can keep going around it. That's why it can be kind of done in a 10-minute appointment, because you can just pick off a little part of that. But it's also something that, you know, you don't even have to have a conversation. You can have a conversation with yourself about it. You can have a conversation with yourself about what your best hopes are, what your strengths and resources are, what might be, you know, just that little tiny next step. And also this issue about noticing when you feel good and what's working, and doing more of that. And have that kind of relentless future focus, that sort of forward focus, rather than kind of the backward looking, if only I'd done that differently, or...
Oh, that's a dangerous path to go down, isn't it?
It is.
You spend ages doing that.
Yeah.
And I was trying to find something. I was going through the videos, and I thought it must have been in the Q&A or something. But actually, I came to the conclusion it was a conversation we had off stage, when you were off stage, and I think I was talking to you about this model. And something that you said to me that really hit home was that another thing that's key is to start where the other person is at. And the example you gave, I think, was somebody who was suffering really badly from depression. And you were talking about this idea of scaling and asking where they were and what they could do to change. And they were in a really terrible place. And for them, from moving to whatever it was, from 2 to 3, whatever it was, the step that they felt they could take was, I think, something like getting up and pulling the curtains every day.
Yeah.
And yeah, for somebody else who is not in that place would think, well, that seems ridiculous. But that's where it seemed to be a very key thing. You
very
start
massive
where they are.
And that might be a really significant key step for that person, and represent something amazing, because they haven't done that for 6 months or something. So yeah, absolutely, that all the questions are about, well, where are you now? And like you say, they might say 3, and then you can have an interesting chat about why is it already 3 and not 0? What's already going well,
Yes, and that plays into the whole positive cycle that you were talking about, that you've already got something to build on.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're already 3.
And looking for that, because there's loads of science, isn't there, in looking at things like gratitude.
Yes, absolutely.
There's hard science to prove
definitely
the positive impact that it has.
Yeah, so a lot of these ideas come from positive psychology, like the gratitude stuff, like recognizing your own strengths and then working with those. And in fact, there's a free strengths finder on Martin Seligman, who's the kind of the father of positive psychology. Martin Seligman's website, we can probably put a link, and people can go in and fill in that Strengths Finder online, and it'll ping back for your results. I think they use your results obviously in things that they write, but it's fine. It's a free resource. And there's lots of evidence that we all have different kinds of character strengths that we're sort of born with. But if we work with those and we use them every day, that makes us happier. So for example, I'm personally quite an organized I think I came up high on sort of strategy and planning. So I always wake up in the morning and start thinking, right, what am I doing today, kind of thing. And that if I'm doing that, then that's a good sign, and it sort of feeds into my well-being. If things go a bit chaotic, that's not so great for me. But other people have other kinds of strengths, and you can try and build into your day ways of using your strengths and, using that, maybe to help other people or, in whatever way can really boost your emotional health as well. So my doctorate was on the role of hope in people who've had lower limb amputations, and looking at what difference that made. It actually it was the thing that made the biggest difference to people's rehabilitation and quality of life. So people who were sort of high hope people at the beginning did much, much better. And I suppose that isn't surprising, but then again, it kind of is in a way, because it made more difference than any of the physical factors or causes of the amputation, or how severe it was or anything like that.
Yes, it shows the power of the psychological the mind side can have.
Yeah, and hope.
So you can have people who have the exact same physical conditions, but the difference
who do really differently. And it's the same with things like arthritis. It's been repeated in many, many conditions. And hopefulness is about a sense of a positive future. It's about a sense that you personally have the confidence to take the steps to get there. So that's what GRIN's kind of working on. It's working on identifying the positive future, then building up the person's sense of can-do and self-esteem, and then being able to see the steps and having the confidence to take the steps to sort of get there. So that's, in a nutshell, what sort of hopefulness is about. And it does make an incredible difference to the amount of medication people take, the number of symptoms they report, even how long people live. Have you heard of the Nun study?
I haven't.
I think you can just Google the Nun study and it'll come up. They got some young nuns who were going into the convent. They got them to write some diaries and what they were, what their reaction was to, this journey they were going on, etc., etc. And then they followed them up decades and decades later. And the ones that had a sort of hopeful narrative about what they were doing, these women were still all alive in their 80s and thriving. And the ones with the more negative attitudes were not. And just very, very interesting that hopeful attitude. And if we can help people to find it or re-find it or just nurture it in themselves, can really make a massive difference to mental well-being, but also longevity.
Because it really impacts your general day-to-day, how much you're enjoying life. I can remember the first time I did the gratitude exercise. It was a challenge that I read somewhere, and 30 days I had to write 3 things down, and it was really difficult to start with. And I was one of these kind of, glass half empty type people, and would quite quickly jump to seeing the negative in a situation. I blame my mother, of course.
Of course. Quite right. We all do that.
But what I found during the month was that although it was hard to start with, one, it got easier.
Yeah.
But 2, I started to realize that I was starting to look for things to write down at the end of the day. I used to do it at the end of the day. So during the day, I was looking for those things.
Yeah.
And it absolutely had a profound effect. It was a small thing, but it completely changed my perspective.
Yes.
And now my tendency is much more to see the good in something. Before I see the bad. So,
and that was that's Martin Seligman's one of his experiments. And if you go on his website, it's described there with the data, as you say, you know, hard data that it actually helps people with mood and so on. And people can see it described there as, yes, it's a really simple yet really effective thing to do. And it's just to do with where do you shine the light of your attention. We can only think about one thing at a time. So if you're thinking, what a lovely sunset, you're not thinking, I don't know, I shouldn't have said that to Derek this afternoon. What a twit I am, or something. You know, you can only think about one thing at a time. And to some extent, we do have some control over that. We have some choices about where we put our attention. And I think the power of the sort of GRIN questions is you're just gently encouraging people to put their attention on what works, when do you feel good, you know, look what an effect you can have on, you know, you're making a difference to this, you can do it, kind of thing. And then that momentum growing so that they feel more competent and confident, and they're actually making changes and then just pursuing what works for them.
And small steps, small, easy steps. And like you say, you keep going round the cycle. So you keep reinforcing it. And before you know it, you know, you talk to that person a year down the line, and the steps that they're now taking, or, you know, where they've got from where they were to where they are, if you'd have somehow been able to show them that on that day one, they'd have thought you were nuts. You know, there's no way I can do that.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And that's the joy of the group work is that really is just seeing people, because you see them month by month, and, you know, they bring in their pants and their photos to show it. It's not all about weight, but, you know, they really celebrate with each other the difference that approach has made. Just keep going and just keep consistent with these changes. And they really, the quality of life is really transformed. It's fantastic.
What's so sad for me is that anything that is done to block this kind of work, be it diet, be it more the psychological side, I mean, that model that you've been talking about, together with a low carb approach, just seems to be such a perfect thing to do within the limitations of the NHS, but it's going to be the same in other countries. It seems like such a perfect model to be able to offer people, not just for the people coming in who have the problems, but the people who are providing the information. It's good for them too. It's good for their health. It's good for their well-being. And so the whole energy of the process is positive.
Yeah, there's evidence that the solution-focused approach, which is essentially what it is really good in terms of reducing staff burnout, because it's such a positive way to work, and also you're working with people's goals. You're not trying to kind of get them to follow your advice, which is, you know, it can be a bit soul destroying, really, because people don't always follow advice. I know I don't. So, you know, if it was just a case of needing more information, well, we'll all have done it already, won't we? You know, there's plenty of information on cigarette packets that it's not a good idea to smoke, and that doesn't change people's behaviour. Everybody knows that sugar's not good for you.
Yeah. Ultimately, there's a tendency sometimes to run doctors down for not embracing this, but ultimately anyone who enters, well, not anyone, but I would say most of the people who enter this kind of profession or the caring profession in some way do it because they want to help people.
Yeah.
So ultimately, if they're given the tools to do their job more effectively in that respect, it's just going to benefit everybody.
Yes. Progress is cheerful, isn't it? So, you know, it's cheerful for the patients and it's cheerful for the practitioners. Yeah, definitely.
Well, on that positive note,
excellent.
I hope that things do start changing, perhaps more rapidly in that direction. And I urge anyone who's listening who hasn't signed the petition already, I know many, many people have, to go and sign that, to do their little bit to help prod things in the right direction.
Thank you.
It's been fantastic speaking to you. I could go on chatting about all these things for hours.
Me too.
Perhaps you could leave us with a top tip.
Okay. So you asked me that at the beginning, and what I thought I was going to say, which I will say actually, is in terms of the sort of sugar addiction piece, or the, in terms of sort of getting rid of cravings or being able to kind of stay the path, always pay attention to what is it you can't moderate. And if you feel your relationship with a certain food is getting out of hand, then, try and cut that out for a bit. I've recently finally accepted that I need to cut out dairy because I just can't moderate. I love it, but I just can't moderate it. And actually, I don't miss it, and I just feel calmer and more relaxed. So I would encourage people to pay attention to what they can't moderate. So that's what I was going to say at the beginning. And then as we were talking at the end, I was just thinking that maybe it links in really, that noticing is really important. So notice when you feel really well, or if you felt really well for a bit and then you suddenly don't, that's kind of important information. Or when do you feel calm in the mind, so noticing and paying attention to your own physical and psychological states will give you so much information that you can then act on, try something different.
Yes, and I think it plays in very well to a lot of people in the low carb and ketogenic community. They love to embrace self-experimentation. So they're already in this mindset. Yes. So any kind of challenge like that, any kind of playing around, and you don't have to necessarily put it down as a long-term stamp. So if you suspect that dairy might be an issue, well, just set yourself a challenge to get rid of it for just a month
and see what happens. Exactly.
Yeah.
There isn't. I think people starting out want how many grams of this, how many grams of that. When do I not? And that's okay to start with, isn't it? But I think then we've all got our unique. Obviously, we're all different. We've all got our unique way of doing it and what's right for us. And there isn't a right answer. Some people are really good on dairy. Nuts. There's all kinds of things where you could go your own way, and the frequency with which you eat, etc., etc. All of that can be tailored to your own reactions and goals, and what your aims are really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I have already got a list of things to put in the show notes that I either found before or have taken a note of while we've been recording. Is there anything else, any other place that you would like me to point people in the right direction? Some, to follow on social media or anything like that?
Oh, they can follow me on Twitter at Jen_Unwin. I'll send you the paper so people can, it's open access, so people can have a look at that.
Yes, I found it earlier actually.
The PHC you're going to link to anyway, so that's lovely. Yeah, I think those are the main ones.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. It has been a very great pleasure talking to you today, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you.
To get the resources and links from this show, please go to ketowomanpodcast.com/episodes. Please share this podcast with as many people as possible by sharing one of my links or just taking a screenshot of an episode that you enjoyed. Reviews really help raise the profile of the podcast, which gets it in front of more people, but also helps me attract a wide variety of guests. So please take a minute to leave a review on whichever podcast app or platform you like to listen on. It doesn't go unnoticed by me, the people who regularly like, share and comment on my posts. Your support really does mean the world to me. Thank you. Are you enjoying this podcast? Help me make more episodes and videos by making a pledge at my Patreon page, patreon.com/KetoWoman. Or simply hit the support button on the Keto Woman Podcast website. Don't forget to join in the fun on the Keto Woman Podcast Instagram and Facebook pages, and Daisy_Keto Woman on Twitter. Are you my next extraordinary woman? Maybe you've got an idea for a show, a topic you would like to hear about. Let me know how I can tickle your earbuds by dropping me a line at daisy@ketowomanpodcast.com. This week's end quote is from Martin Seligman. Optimism generates hope. Hope releases dreams. Dreams set goals. Enthusiasm follows. Bye-bye, Keto Lovelies.